He was a member of Her Majesty's Royal Navy. So he served in North Africa and in Italy during the war. Ray saw some stuff. Ray experienced a lot during his time in combat, doing battle not just with the Italians, but later with the Nazis. And along the way, Ray became convinced of one thing. He became convinced that the world desperately needed Jesus. And so he committed that if he survived the war, he was going to devote his life to missionary work. And it was at about this time that he came out of a military hospital after suffering a pretty serious illness after the invasion of northern Italy, and he got assigned to the Pacific. So for you World War II buffs out there, you know that the Pacific was a horrific theater of war. Well, he got there just in time for the end. He got there just in time for the nukes to fall. And afterward, moving through Japan, he was gripped by the suffering of the Japanese people. Hundreds of thousands of them had been wiped out at the blink of an eye. Many more were suffering radiation sickness. Their economy had collapsed and their country had been destroyed, fighting a war for a man who thought he was a god. So Ray decided that he was going to spend his life trying to get the gospel to the people of Japan. He went back to his native England, studied, tried to do everything he could to prepare himself to become an evangelist, met a woman, married her, fell in love, they had some kids. But all of this was in the context of Ray devoting his life to seeing the gospel of Jesus spread. So Ray was actually the first English-speaking missionary on the ground in Japan after World War II. And Ray attempted some great things for God, and he accomplished some great things for God. He came to Japan not speaking a lick of Japanese, not a lick. And by the time his time in Japan was over, not only did he speak the language, he had helped translate the Bible and a whole host of classic Christian works into Japanese and distributed it to the Japanese. The reason that the Japanese Christian church exists today is because of Ray. While he was in Japan, Ray had a couple of daughters with his wife, and he loved them all very dearly. But then they were reassigned to the Philippines, so they became missionaries in the Philippines. And to make a really long story short, Ray's life took a turn. Keep in mind, we're talking about a man here who had seen death and bloodshed and war, and it had not made him worse, it had made him better. We're talking about a man who had devoted his life to the worship of Jesus. We're talking about a man who devoted his life to the spread of the gospel. Something happened. His wife, whom he loved very dearly, got sick. Violently sick. And so in the hopes of finding a doctor that could care for her, he got himself reassigned as a missionary here in the United States. But it didn't matter. His wife died. And that death broke Ray in a way that World War II never could. He became a very different man. The gentle, quiet spirit was gone and replaced with a lot of anger and a lot of grief. And his two daughters shared in that anger and grief, that sense of lostness, now that their mother was gone. Ray couldn't understand why God would let that happen. If you were to look at his diaries from that time period, you would find a lot of questions for God, a lot of anger at God. Why would you do this to me? What do you want from me? Ray's daughters were traumatized by the death of their mother, and they were also traumatized by their father's subsequent emotional distance. Ray's dad had not been much of a help to him in terms of how to deal with his emotions, and so Ray didn't know how to deal with his. And so his daughters didn't know how to deal with theirs. They grew up. They stayed in the faith, but they too had some angry questions for God. Like their father, they were grieved, upset, frightened, hurt, angry people, mostly angry at God, who they professed to love and follow. So they were church members their entire lives. They married believers. But one of those daughters married a man who she loved. He was also a believer, but he had some very serious mental and emotional problems, very serious issues. He was an ex-drug addict. And while he wanted to be a good father and be a good husband, he simply hadn't been equipped either. The two of them had a daughter together. And unfortunately, the stress of poverty in an America that at the time was racked by the Cold War, the difficulty of joblessness and at times the threat of homelessness caused Ray's daughter and her husband to change even more than they already had. Suffering did not make them better the way that it had Ray. It made them worse. And they inflicted their suffering on their daughter. They abused her. They beat her. They at times would lock her in her room for days on end without food and without water. All the while telling her that they loved her and that Jesus loved her. Now, do you see the progression here? A profound experience of suffering in a man's life changed him for the worse. And it changed his kids for the worse. And those kids in turn had kids. What do you suppose is going to happen to that little girl, that 7 or 8-year-old girl who's locked in her room, hungry and scared and alone? Yes, Tiernan. In other words, you would expect that she's going to perhaps come out even worse off than her parents did, right? But you know, a funny thing happens. That little girl in that closet doesn't believe a lot that her parents tell her, but she does believe one thing. She does believe that Jesus loves her. And so that little girl retreats into herself to survive. She walls herself off. She does what's necessary to make it. But when she's locked in that room at night, alone and hungry and afraid, she casts her anxieties on Jesus because she believes that he cares for him. That little girl grew up and married me. Yeah. And we had 4 kids together. And do you know what? I have never known a woman in my life who is holier and happier in Jesus than my wife, Margaret. 1 Peter chapter 5 contains one of the most breathtaking sentences in the entire Bible. It comes at the very end of the section we're going to read. If you don't have your Bible open, I would encourage you to do so. 1 Peter chapter 5. Listen to what Peter has to say. He's just finished talking about suffering in a manner that pleases God. And then he says this, chapter 5, verse 1. And now, a word to you who are elders in the churches. It is say pastors. I too am an elder and a witness to the sufferings of Christ. It is say Peter saying, I saw Jesus die. And I too will share in his glory when he is revealed to the whole world. So, as a fellow elder, I appeal to you. Care for the flock that God has entrusted to you. Watch over it willingly, not grudgingly. Not for what you will get out of it, but because you are eager to serve God. Don't lord it over the people assigned to your care, but lead them by your own good example. And when the great shepherd appears, you will receive a crown of never-ending glory and honor. Verse 5. In the same way, you who are younger must accept the authority of the elders, and all of you dress yourselves in humility as you relate to one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So, humble yourselves under the mighty power of God, and at the right time he will lift you up in honor. And then here it is. Give all your worries and cares to God, for he cares for you. This is the word of the Lord. You know, I am never surprised by a story of someone who experiences some kind of suffering and then becomes a worse person for it. That does not surprise me. As a matter of fact, some of our favorite movies and stories contain characters who experience exactly that kind of thing. Batman, Like, the whole story of Batman is that this dude experiences the murder of his parents in front of him and starts dressing up as an animal vigilante and beating up criminals at night. That's not a good outcome, just so we're clear. Like, Batman needs a therapist. And, maybe a Prozac prescription. Is it, though? Now, that's just one example of literally dozens of stories of people who experience some kind of brokenness and suffer even more as a result. But we also really love stories where the opposite happens. We really love stories where instead of becoming worse, somehow these people sort of rise above and conquer, right? They become good people in spite of everything that happened to them, so on. We love those kinds of stories, right? But does that ever actually happen? Does that ever actually happen? Nick's like, I wasn't listening. It's okay. Oh, I see. Nifty. Peter, keep in mind, is writing to some people who know about suffering. They know a lot about it, and they're about to know more because Nero's persecution is about to begin, if you recall. And Peter is wrapping up what he has to say to them. So he gives us some specific instructions, and he's writing to two groups of people here, but he gives them the same set of instructions, basically. He writes to pastors in the churches in the areas he's writing to, and he's writing to members of the congregations that he's writing to. Does that make sense? He calls them elders here. Your translation might say pastors or overseers. It all just means pastor. Make sense? Now, you might take a look at this and say to yourself, okay, what does the pastor component have to do with me? I'm not a pastor. Shouldn't you be preaching this to yourself? Well, yes, and I'm going to do that in a second. But I want to really focus in on three things that are in this text that show up as commands from God for a time of suffering on the basis of verse 7. Give all your worries and cares to God, for he cares about you. So, the main, for lack of a better way to put this, actually, you know what, I take that back. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's do this, since I can't seem to get that to work. Let's play a little bit of a, I don't know, it's not quite a word association game, but let's come up with a bit of a thought bubble. Did they seriously they did. They took my marker again. Why do they hate me? Was it? Thanks, Nick. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to throw up on the board the kinds of things that we worry about. We're going to throw up on the board the kind of things that make us anxious. Yes, Nick? Yes, ma'am. Being alive. Yes. Very hard to do, anxiety-inducing. Isn't it, though? Jenna's like, and I'm out. Close enough. Okay, so being alive. What else? What else do you find yourself worrying about, being anxious about? School. Yeah. Yes, Tiernan. I'm sorry, say that again. Hey, Rocky, do me a favor. Respect the man. Say that one more time. Okay. Yeah, I get you. Worried about we'll call it situational outcomes. Yeah. Noah, what'd you have? The future. Yes. The future. Future. That was a sponge. People. Yes, Lily. Waking up in the morning. Y'all are not okay. Oh, thank you. Y'all are not okay. What else? Death. Death? Both of you death. Yeah. Worried about dying. Yeah. That's for real. What else? Lost, yeah. Yeah, loss of relationship. What else? What else can we come up with? Y'all ain't got to the real stuff yet. Yeah. Sorry, one more time. Getting old. For all you parents watching the live stream, that's all right. What else? Yeah. Finding an identity or finding a career. Yeah. Now, notice what is not on this list. Death is on this list. That's pretty serious. Yeah, that's on there. Yeah, good. Hell. Ooh, yes. Hell. Yes, eternal damnation. Hey. I beg your pardon? It's a Bible word, sir. Are you Aaron Burr, sir? That depends who's asking. Oh, well, sure, sir. Sorry, I won't do that. Watch this. YouTube's going to flag this video now for those 6 lines. Anyway, this list is very interesting. Death and hell, these are some very serious ideas. But what do you suppose would be on this list for the people that Peter is writing to? What would they put up on this list that they're anxious about? Persecution, yeah. Specifically, what about persecution? I mean, persecution's kind of it's a good umbrella term, but what underneath that are they worried about? Worried about maybe being murdered, perhaps. Not just the loss of relationships or people to, conflict, but having spouses or children killed in the streets. Loss of personal property, rights, autonomy. Those kinds of things, right? Now, this is where, if it was the year 2006, your youth pastor would get up and say, see, you don't have it so bad, so suck it up. But I'm not doing that. And I'm not doing that for 2 reasons. One, this is serious freaking business. Y'all are not okay. And to be clear, that's not a surprise to me. I know. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, that one's for real. That one goes back for as long as we've had wheeled implements for driving. Yeah. David Micah Bronson? That's how I knew my life was over. Now, all these things that we're anxious about, all of them, every single one of them have to do with, this might seem obvious, but duh, but here's what I mean. You are worried about you, right? You are worried about you dying. You are worried about you losing people. You are worried about your situational outcomes. You are worried about your future, right? Maybe there are a few of you out there who are like, I'm also worried about the oceans rising and the end of the world coming. Okay, cool. Global warming, whatever, fine. But what I'm driving at is that generally speaking, when we talk about anxiety or worry, we're worried for us, and there's a good reason. There's not a single thing on these lists that's not something that's worth worrying about, right? Now, some of you might look at this and go, well, I don't worry about that. That's not valid. Yeah, here's the thing. This is where empathy and, funnily enough, humility, which is in the text, become really handy. They're really useful. Just because you don't experience some of these anxieties doesn't mean that others don't and that they're not just as serious as yours, but we'll let that lie for now. Here's what I'm driving at. Peter's got 3 commands in this text that are all primarily aimed at these anxieties, aimed at these concerns, these worries. You might not see it right away, but let's examine them. Peter's basic command here in this text is this. Get rid of this here. Peter's basic command is forget about yourself. Forget about yourself. Now, to be clear here, I don't mean forget about yourself as in you don't matter. Peter doesn't mean forget about yourself as in your concerns are dumb and you shouldn't be worried about them. Peter doesn't mean forget about yourself because God doesn't give a rip about you, so you might as well just die anyway. No, 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 no. Peter is actually encouraging something in the positive here. Peter's command is to forget about yourself because you can trust that God has not forgotten you. There are really three ideas here. So if you take a look at this first section, where from verses 1 through 5, I want to take a look at this. This is the part where he talks to pastors and congregants. So listen carefully, please. Hadler, you all right there? Listen carefully, please, to what he has to say to these two groups of people, a group of people in authority and a group of people following those in authority. Here's what he says to them. And now, a word to you who are elders in the churches. I, too, am an elder and a witness to the sufferings of Christ, and I, too, will share in his glory when he is revealed to the whole world. As a fellow elder, I appeal to you. Care for the flock that God has entrusted to you. There's a command, right? He's telling his pastors, care for the flock. You all right, Nick?
Hey, I'll punch him.
I'm thinking about it. Rocky, you all right? Okay. Then a second command, watch over it. That is to say, watch over the congregation willingly, not grudgingly, not for what you will get out of it, but because you are eager to serve God. Don't lord it over the people assigned to your care, but lead them by your own good example. And when the great shepherd appears, you will receive a crown of never-ending glory and honor. Okay, so this is a set of commands that has to do with relationships. It has to do with the relationships that exist between pastors and their people, but there's also a more general sense in which this applies to every single one of us. These commands have to do with how we relate to each other. And he goes on, he also speaks, he says, in the same way, you who are younger must accept the authority of the elders, and all of you, dress yourselves in humility as you relate to one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So, as an aside, notice here, Peter gives 4 verses of commands and instructions to those who are in authority and just 1 to those who are under authority. So that's indicative. I should be sitting up and taking notice. Peter's literally spending 4 times as much attention being concerned about my life and conduct here than he is about yours. Do you see? Do you see why that's significant? Peter's laying something on me here as someone who's going to have to answer to God for you. As an aside, do you realize that? Do you realize that? So, Gavin, there will be a point in my life where I will have to stand in front of God, and he's going to say, okay, so tell me about Gavin. You were responsible for him for this set of time. So let's talk about whether or not you discharge that responsibility faithfully, right? I will have to answer for you. I will have to answer for Hallie. I will have to answer for Alex. I will have to answer for Paxton, and so on. And that's an honor and a privilege, but it's very serious business. And so Peter's encouraging me to do some things here that, if you think about it, are dangerous to me. He's giving some commands here that represent a threat to me. Listen again. He says in verse 2, care for the flock of God, a flock that God has entrusted to you. Watch over it willingly, not grudgingly, not for what you will get out of it, but because you are eager to serve God. In other words, I'm supposed to be caring for y'all whether or not I'm getting anything out of it or anything back from y'all. And so that means that there's an imbalance in our relationship, right? Because Peter's telling me I have to keep giving whether I'm getting or not. In other words, y'all could take advantage of me. You could, right? But Peter's commanding it anyway. The why is in verse 7. We'll get to that in a minute. But that's what he's commanding me. He goes further. He says, don't lord it over the people assigned to your care, but lead them by your own good example. And when the great shepherd appears, you will receive a crown of never-ending glory and honor. Keep something in mind here. He's talking to pastors who are facing persecution. So there's a way in which what he's saying here is you should be the first to walk into the Roman spears. You should be the first one to volunteer to go into the arena to die. You should be the first to get picked up. Does that make sense? That's what he's telling these guys. And that's personally dangerous, not just to sort of their feelings, but to their bodies. But it's not just dangerous to the pastors in question, because he also gives some dangerous commands to those who follow these pastors. He says, in the same way, you who are younger must accept the authority of the elders. Well, hold on a minute. That's risky. What if they make a dumb decision, Philip? To who? The Romans? What happens if the person that you're following fails? You see? The stakes are high. You with me? Peter's able to command this, not because he thinks that the people under his care are perfect and are going to sort of do all of these things perfectly. We know from the rest of the New Testament that there were pastors who did lord it over their people. 3 John talks about that. We also know that there were congregants who took advantage of their pastors. 2 Corinthians talks about that. So why can Peter say this? He can say this. He can say, forget about yourself, pastor, and serve your people. He can say, forget about yourself, people, and follow your pastor, right? You can do this. You can love each other humbly, right? You can love each other humbly without fear of being taken advantage of. Now, is he saying that you can love each other humbly without fear for being taken advantage of because no one's going to take advantage of you? Is that what he's saying? No. There's a very real possibility that y'all will abuse this command and take advantage of me, and there's a very real possibility, God forbid, that I will disobey this command and take advantage of you. That's on the table. Yes, sir. Humbly? Yeah, sorry. That's on the table. There's a brief pause here. As Christians, we got to stop being surprised when we sin against each other. We really do. We got to stop being surprised. Like, Keenan, you're a sinner. He's like, yes, absolutely. Yes, I too am a sinner. Here's the thing, Keenan. We're going to sin against each other. But here, and this is the critical bit. This is why humility is necessary. Because when I sin against Keenan and he comes to me and he says, hey man, you did this and it wounded me. I've got to be humble enough to not have my first reaction be, oh, what are you talking about? I've got to be humble enough to go, oh man, did I? I'm sorry. Can you forgive me? Do you see? That's how that's supposed to work. We need to stop expecting each other to behave perfectly and instead start acting as though we are aware of our own sinful tendencies. Do you see? That's just a freebie. Point is, in this text, Peter is teaching Christians to love each other humbly without fear of being taken advantage of, not because they won't be taken advantage of, but because of verse 7. Now, what does verse 7 have to do with this idea? We'll get to that in a second, because there's another idea. He says in the back half of this section, the back half of verse 5, he says, and all of you must dress yourselves, literally put on, like a garment, put on humility as you relate to one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So, humble yourselves under the mighty power of God, and at the right time, he will lift you up in honor. In other words, forget about yourself. Think of yourself less. And think of others more. Now, when I say the word humility, we probably think, okay, well, that just means that I should think less of myself. I shouldn't think that I'm so awesome, so special, so high and mighty. That's not what humility is about at all. Humility is not about thinking less of yourself. It is about thinking of yourself less. I'm going to say that one more time because that's worth remembering. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. You are valuable, Daniel. And at no point would it be appropriate or healthy for you to act like you're not. Right? Know your worth, King. Know your worth. But you should think of yourself, think about yourself less. That's the fundamental command in this text. Forget about yourself. Think of others more. And when he's saying think of others, he's thinking of fellow Christians here. Right? That's who he's got in mind. That's the second command of the text. Think of yourself less, think of others more. And if you are one of Peter's readers, this is going to sound insane. I mean, don't you need to be writing your senator? Don't you need to be campaigning across Bithynia to make sure that some anti-persecution restrictions are passed? Right? Don't you need to be getting your guns and your swords and running up into the hills to fight the Romans when they come for you? And yet, the whole time, if you haven't been paying attention, 1 Peter does not teach that kind of thing, does it? Instead, 1 Peter is interested in one thing and in one thing only. It is interested in the hope of Christians in the face of suffering. He's far more concerned about Christians living out the values of the kingdom towards their enemies, loving their enemies, even where necessary, submitting to the appropriate governmental authority of their enemies, than he is about them defending their lives. Have you noticed that? There's not a single command in this book to defend yourself. There's not a single command in this book to protect your life. Is that because God does not value your life? Of course not. So what gives? Why is he able to say this? Well, he told us back in chapter 1, and he's told us here as well, but I'll want to link these thoughts for you. All the way back in 1 Peter chapter 1, we're told explicitly, verse 3, all praise to God the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. It is by his great mercy that we have been given new life because God raised Jesus Christ from the dead. In other words, the worst thing that could happen to you isn't being murdered by the Romans. The worst thing that could happen to you isn't that your property get taken and you be thrown in prison. The worst thing that could happen to you is you stop trusting Jesus. Do you see? The worst thing that could happen to you is that you lose your grip on the gospel that put that new life in you in the first place. And he reminds us of the same thing here in chapter 5. He says, humble yourselves because at the right time God will lift you up in honor. And just in case you don't believe him, just in case you haven't been tracking this whole time, he drops verse 7 on us. Forget about yourself because God has not forgotten you. Because God has not forgotten you. Yes, sir. That's an extremely good question, Philip. And there's been a ton of debate over the years about that. I'll withhold my answer for now, but I'll say that there have been faithful Christians on both sides of that question. There are some who say, okay, yes, there's some circumstances in which it is necessary to fight. There are other circumstances in which you should not. There are other Christians who say, we don't worry about that at all. And there are very strong arguments on both ends of that. And so if you really want to do a deep dive on that, we can talk about it. But that's an excellent question. Right. Yeah. There's some tension here, isn't there? There's some real tension here. Now, here's what I want to kind of pull out of this. Notice what it says that we're supposed to do with our worries. Our worries about whether or not we'll take advantage of each other. Our worries about what the Romans are going to do to us. What are we supposed to do in verse 7? What do you do with your worries and your cares, according to verse 7? What do you do with your anxieties? You cast them. You know, in Greek, this is a really interesting word because this is one of only 2 times this word cast shows up in the New Testament. One of only 2 times. You know what the other time is? It's when Jesus climbs up on a donkey to ride into Jerusalem. Yeah, that word cast is used to describe what Jesus' followers are doing with their clothing and with palm branches to make a way for Jesus to ride into Jerusalem on. I bring that up to say the notion of cast here is of straight up hucking something, okay? Cast your worries, cast your cares upon God. Here's the thing. Way too often, we carry our anxieties. Way too often, we carry our cares. Cares are not to be carried. Cares are to be cast. Do you like that, Mikey? A little bit of alliteration there. But I'm serious. And I say this, I don't say this lightly. I say this as somebody who's got the generalized anxiety disorder diagnosis. I say this as somebody who's got the PTSD diagnosis, okay? Anxieties, it is not sinful to experience anxiety, but God wants better for you. What this verse is not pitching is that Jesus is going to heal your generalized anxiety disorder or that he's going to heal your PTSD or any of those things. That's not what's in view here, okay? People will say that sometimes. That's not what this text is about. What this text is saying, however, is just like all along the way, Peter's been talking about how suffering purifies faith, how suffering purifies trust, how it shows what's really in us. He's saying when you suffer anxiety, when you suffer worry and care, cast it on God because he cares for you. You know, the thing about experiences like the ones we put up on the board is that sometimes when those things happen, you can be really tempted to ask yourself why. You ever had that experience? Something bad happens to you and you find yourself asking, why did this happen to me? Why did God allow this to happen to me? What is God, and sometimes you ask yourself, what is God trying to teach me through this experience? You ever asked yourself that one? I can tell you what the answer to that is. In every single instance in which you have ever experienced suffering in your life and you're asking yourself, why did God let that happen to me? The answer is right here. The answer is he is revealing what you really trust. When you're experiencing anxiety or you're having a panic attack, right, or an anxiety attack, where do you tend to go? You try to sleep, try to binge Netflix. Maybe you're an eater, maybe you're an anxious eater. Do what? Your cat. Yeah. Yeah. And I get it. I do those things too. But Peter's encouraging us to something better than binging Netflix to deal with our anxiety. He's suggesting that God actually gives a rip. And that's a little odd. I don't think we think very often of God as caring about our day-to-day worries, our day-to-day anxieties. And yet this is exactly what Peter is saying. Give all your worries and cares to God, for he cares about you, and he's doing something with those anxieties and worries. I talked about Ray earlier, Margaret's grandpa. He wondered to the end of his life why God would take his wife from him. He wondered why God would let that happen to him. But do you know what Ray didn't know? Ray, after his wife died, some years after his grown children moved out of the house, Ray met another woman. He'd done his grieving, and he met a woman and he fell in love with her and he married her. And when one of his daughters had a little girl named Margaret, the only grandma that that little girl knew was Ray's second wife. And Ray's second wife was one of the most gentle, gracious, Jesus-soaked people that you could ever meet. She died this year. And that grandma was the one who told that 7-year-old girl over and over and over again, Jesus cares for you. Why did God take Ray's wife? Because God knew that one day there was going to be a very frightened, very alone, very hungry 7-year-old girl locked in a room who would need a grandmother who loved her enough and cared for her enough to encourage her to do exactly this, to cast her anxieties on God. John Piper has famously said that, God is always doing about 1 million things in your life at any one time, and at best you might be aware of 3 of them. Our worries tend to fit into that category sometimes. You might be here tonight and you might think, that your worries and anxieties are too small for God, or you might be thinking that they're simply too big for him. I assure you that they are not. This term, cares for you, is a little bit of a pun. Verse 7, give all your worries and cares, literally anxieties, to God, for he is anxious about you, is literally what it says in the Greek. Do you see? You can forget about yourself and do these things in spite of the risk that they bring, because God is being anxious for you. Do you get it? Now, there's a whole host of things to be said about this, and I know that many of you struggle with anxiety, and you probably have 1 million questions. That's okay. Our podcast has done an episode on anxiety, and you're welcome to check that out on Spotify if you want to know more. I'm also happy to talk to you about my own experiences with this and sort of walk through what it looks like for us to work this out, work this through as Christians, faithfully as possible. So I want to invite you, if that's something that you deal with and you want to know more about, or if you need help or relief, come ask me. I'd love to talk with you about that and the hope that Jesus offers in spite of the worries and the cares we experience. So here's what we're going to do. I've kept you too long already. I'm going to let God, as always, have the last word. We'll get out of here. I'm going to Freddy's afterwards. Anxious people, come find me. Galatians chapter 6, verse 18. I love this. Dear brothers and sisters, that's you, that's me. Dear brothers and sisters, may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with your spirit. Amen. Go in peace.